No, they can't get at each other. The Himalayas are in the way, or a bunch of jungle mountains are in the way. So they're not going to like each other, and there's going to be some competition over Southeast Asia. But I think China's situation is so unstable, and India's situation is just so poor. They don't have the financial capacity to impose any sort of reality on anyone. So you'll have them kind of sniping at each other in that region. But ultimately, I think the Chinese competition is going to fall away, and Japan is a far more likely long-term competitor. But Japan is so far away from India that the Indians really don't feel threatened. I think partnership is a more likely outcome there. Well, if you're in a different hemisphere, it's nothing to worry about.
Right.
If you're on the far side of the continent, it's nothing to worry about. But yes, there's always a chance that that could blow up. Now, once the Pakistanis lose their Chinese sponsorship, the question would be whether anyone else decides that they're distrustful of India enough to pick up that mantle. I don't see any obvious candidates. Just assuming Japan plays its cards right and they're pretty savvy on this sort of thing, it won't be them. The biggest problem I would say is if the Europeans get back into the game in a hostile way, that's a long shot, then maybe. But I think Pakistan is going to be more or less on its own. That's not really great. That's not really awful for anyone. India has basically made its development model for the last 50 years ignoring Pakistan, and I don't see any reason that's going to change. And so as long as they've got this big desert buffer between most of their territories, I think it'll be relatively calm. I think if the Indians and the Pakistanis were going to get involved in a real knockdown, drag-out war that involved atomics, it probably would have happened 20 years ago before they established the red line. I don't want to say they trust each other now, but they certainly have learned how to manage their distrust. Sure, so let me do short, medium, and long. Short term, my biggest concern is Mexico. Mexico is facing a pandemic that is every bit as disastrous as what's happening in the United States, but they're doing it without the healthcare system that's necessary to recover while fighting an internal civil war with their own cartels. That is the biggest threat to American manufacturing supply chains right now, and they're not going to get past this probably until we have a vaccine. So we're talking a year or more. That's a fair amount of degradation. That's not something I'm looking forward to. Midterm, the Americans couldn't care less about the Middle East right now, and we've already withdrawn most of the troops. We surged into Saudi Arabia in the Gulf 6 months ago. They're almost all gone already, which means the next time we have a clash in that region, the U.S. just isn't going to be there, and I don't think anyone in the world of energy has priced that in. You add in the fact that our brief little stint with negative prices and an ongoing period of low prices means that we're probably going to lose 10 to 20 million barrels per day of oil production for several years this year. You have insufficient crude in the market. You have a supply shock because of a military conflict. That adds up to be a real disaster really quick, and that will induce the Trump administration or its successor to simply ban oil exports from the United States and separate the North American system in energy from the rest of the world. If you're in North America, that's more or less okay. If you're in the rest of the world, that is very close to the worst case scenario. And that assumes the US doesn't do anything to take advantage of the situation, which, really?
Right.
It's like, so the United States goes from being the guarantee of global energy to a primary breaker of global energy. And that will allow the United States, or really anyone who has a degree of energy security, to break whatever country they want on whatever time frame, whenever they want. Long term, if China doesn't make it, Japan basically takes over as the de facto power of East Asia. We've been here before too. And the Japanese already have better relations with the Southeast Asians than I would argue the Chinese or the Americans. And as I mentioned, there might even be a potential room for cooperation with the Indians. That gives us something that Asia has never had. A local superpower with a navy and with trust throughout the entire rim. Now, it is not a foregone conclusion that the Japanese or a Japanese alliance will fall into conflict with any other power in the world, most notably the United States. If anything, the Japanese understand that the United States has a number of red lines and a number of red buttons that it is willing to push. But we haven't had that kind of a thessalocracy, is the technical term, a seaborne merchant empire, since the time of the British Empire. Can you imagine how the British Empire would have evolved if it had nuclear weapons? That's my big concern moving forward. Now, that's a concern for 10 plus years, probably 20 plus years down the line, but that is likely to be the next big chapter of human history. But China as a unified entity outside of the global order era has only existed for about a century of that. Chinese history is replete with horrific ways how it can all go to hell in a very short period of time. Now, if I were a betting man and I had to kind of sketch out how this is going to go, we're going to have an energy crisis, we're going to have a demographic crisis, a consumption crisis, an export crisis, and a financial crisis, all more or less at the same time. It doesn't really matter which one of them cooks this off. All of them are bad, and all of them are going to reinforce. In that environment, the northern core Han territories, northern China, Beijing, that area, it kind of devolves into a neo-Maoist tyranny. That's where 3/4 of the population lives, and this farmland requires something like 7 times the global average in inputs in order to just keep it self-sufficient. That's going to break down, so we're going to have famine, we're going to have a dictatorial regime. The areas out west, Xinjiang, Tibet, probably will be on their own. That isn't necessarily a net improvement for them in terms of living standards, despite what the politics might suggest. South, Yangtze down to Hong Kong probably become de facto independent city-states. We've seen this show before too, and they will likely start integrating with foreign countries, maybe even foreign companies. Remember that the Australians did a big piece of this the last time around. Obviously, the French and the Brits and the Russians and the Americans played in that particular pond. But these city-states have historically gotten more of their food from the wider world than even from their own countrymen. They've never really been part of a unified China, except in some very specific circumstances, like right now. There you already have China in 4 functional pieces. Well, functional might not be the best word, but functionally independent entities. That's the most likely outcome, and that is an outcome I can absolutely see the Japanese encouraging.
Yeah. Peter, we've run out of time. In fact, we've run over, but I could talk to you all day. I'm going to do this for you, because anyone watching this book is fantastic. You can sit back. You don't have to plug it. I'll plug it for you, which is way more impressive when other people plug it. But seriously, as you've seen for the last hour.
Sure. So I'm all